The Arxin biomechanics team had planned for many possible outcomes. The human might collapse from the cold, start shaking uncontrollably, or even suffer some minor frostbite. What they didn't expect, what no one could have imagined, was that the human would fall asleep. Not from exhaustion, not by accident. He calmly found a spot, crossed his arms like he was waiting for a bus, leaned against the wall of the freezing chamber, and started snoring. Dr. Kethel was the first to break the silence. Is he dead? No, vitals are steady, said the telemetry officer, scrolling through data. Heart rate's low, breathing slow but regular. Brain activity shows early-stage sleep. Yes, he's napping. The human's name was Mark Davis, 37 years old. He used to work in wilderness search and rescue in central Alaska. His records showed he'd faced brutal cold, blizzards, freezing rivers, nights with no shelter, no implants, no special gear, just thick body fat, a slow metabolism, and a strange tolerance for discomfort. The Arxin had asked for test subjects for their endurance study. Mark signed up while holding a coffee and smiling. How cold is it in there? Kethel asked. -6 degrees Celsius inside. The floor is even colder, around -12. He's using a heat source? No, he refused any warming gear. That's just a basic jacket. The jacket was a thick canvas parka, goose-down filled, worn and patched in 3 places. Mark had brought it himself, stating simply, "This old thing kept me alive in a February whiteout. She'll do fine here." 30 minutes into the trial, Mark had sat down, exhaled slowly, and said aloud, "Wake me if something interesting happens." Now he was asleep. The Arxine engineers stared through the triple-paned view glass in silent disbelief. "Begin external stressor protocol," Kethel ordered. "We're escalating this?" Of his sleeping, we need a physiological response. A side nozzle opened. A dry mist compressor activated, filling the air with microcrystals of pressurized nitrogen vapor. The ambient temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Frost began to form on the chamber's inner seams. Mark scratched his nose in his sleep and turned slightly, tucking his chin into the jacket's collar. "He's adjusting posture for heat retention," the analyst said. "Is that conscious?" "Not at this stage. It's an ingrained habit. The behavior matches someone acclimated to prolonged cold exposure." Kethel blinked. "Is he thermoregulating?" The biometrics lit up. Core temperature had dropped to 36.4 Celsius, well within safe range. His extremities showed slight surface cooling, but nothing alarming. "Frostnip is unlikely at this point," the medic said. "His peripheral vasoconstriction has already started, limiting blood flow to hands and feet. It's a textbook human cold response." They observed for another 20 minutes. No change. Then came the snore. A long, low, unmistakable vibration of nasal passage and throat. Not distress, not gasping, contentment. "He's really sleeping," Kethel said, voice hollow. "I don't understand," said one of the interns. "You explained that humans are mammals with minimal fur, high surface area to volume ratio, no subdermal heat exchange organs. He should be shivering, possibly entering early hypothermia." "Shivering is a response to falling core temp," Kethel muttered, "but his core temp is holding. Fat insulation and perhaps some kind of psychological component." They turned their attention to Mark's data again. Skin temperature was dropping around the cheeks and fingers, but his heart rate remained level. Breathing was deep and unlabored. No sign of distress, no twitching, no involuntary spasms, just sleep. "How long do we wait?" the telemetry officer asked. Kethel was silent. His mandibles tightened slightly in frustration. "Increase exposure." "Drop chamber to -18. The technician hesitated. "That's borderline frostbite territory, especially on unprotected skin." "Just do it." The chamber's vents hissed again. The walls shimmered faintly with the change in pressure. Cold gas poured over Mark's boots. Still no response. At minus 18 degrees Celsius, most Arxen limbs would stiffen. Breathing would become erratic. Their species regulated heat with dermal filaments, retractable under stress, and could not handle extended cold exposure. Mark merely curled tighter. "He's entering REM sleep," the biometric tech said. The room fell quiet. "This is not resistance," Cathiel said finally. "This is adaptation." "No," the medic said. "This is familiarity. He's been here before." At the 1 hour mark, Mark stirred. His eyes fluttered open. He stretched, spine arching slightly, then stood with a grunt. Through the intercom he said, "That was a solid nap. Did I miss anything?" Kethel leaned forward. "You've been in a controlled cold chamber for 60 minutes. External temperature has reached minus 18. We were expecting you to show signs of distress." Mark blinked. "This is it?" "Yes." He reached down and adjusted his bootlaces. "You ever camp in Denali with a broken stove? Minus 30 with wind? This is a spring breeze." "You are unharmed." Mark chuckled. "If anything, I'm annoyed I didn't bring a pillow." Cathiel turned to the observation crew. "End the session. Begin recalibration of what we think humans are." Mark walked out of the chamber unhurried, shaking snow off his collar. "Hey," he said to the medic, "you guys got coffee in this place?" The team stared after him. None of them spoke. Their data banks were full. Their assumptions, however, were completely empty. Mark sat cross-legged on the floor of the mess hall, a mug of hot black coffee balanced in one hand, surrounded by 6 Arxen who clearly weren't used to casual posture or human beverage temperatures. He didn't mind the stares. In fact, he seemed to enjoy them. Dr. Kethel reviewed the raw data again, swiping through the metabolic logs like something must have been missed. Every number matched normal human physiology under controlled cold exposure: reduced skin perfusion, preserved core temperature, marginally slowed heart rate consistent with rest. Nothing dangerous, nothing abnormal, except for the nap. Across the table, Assistant Analyst Vorn cleared his throat, voice metallic through the translator. "Did you prepare for this trial in a specific way? Nutritional loading, chemical conditioning?" "I had bacon and toast," Mark said. "Little too much butter, probably, but no drugs, if that's what you're asking." "Caffeine is a stimulant," Vorn replied, tapping the table. "Not when it's survival grace coffee. That's just breakfast." Kethel looked up. "You realize most subjects we study begin shivering within 10 minutes at minus 6 degrees Celsius." Mark sipped his drink. "That's because they haven't lived in a place where cold is just part of the backdrop. You don't resist it, you work around it. Your extremities showed mild constriction but no nerve pain, no loss of sensation." "I could feel my fingers," Mark said. "They were cold, not dangerous cold, just annoying cold, like waiting for the car heater to kick in." A junior researcher leaned forward. "What is a car heater?" "Forget it," Mark said. "Point is, your test chamber is a walk-in freezer with a fan. I've fallen asleep in worse." That night, the research team convened in the sensor lab to reevaluate human cold response modeling. Cathiel brought up archived footage of other species from earlier endurance trials. None had lasted more than 23 minutes in similar conditions without synthetic thermal support. Arxen neural clusters were particularly vulnerable due to fluid channel insulation pathways that seized under temperature loss. Their cold tolerance plateaued sharply before tissue damage sets in. Their conclusions, therefore, were based on comparative expectations. Mark had shattered that frame. The next morning, Mark was summoned again. This time, not for testing, but for questioning. "What are you doing here?" Kettle asked, skipping formalities. "You mean here on your station?" Mark asked, stretching. "Or here on this project?" "Both. I applied for the endurance trials because your mission statement said something about understanding Earth biophysiology. I figured you needed someone who doesn't freak out the second the thermometer drops." "You're not a biologist." "Nope, just a guy who's dug sleeping pits in permafrost." "This is not normal behavior." Mark shrugged. Neither is volunteering to stand in a snowstorm for science. But you asked. That afternoon, the team proposed a new trial, still cold exposure, but with variables introduced. Mild physical exertion, exposure to simulated wind chill, and a restricted diet beforehand. Mark listened to the plan, then said, "You're trying to stress the system now." "We're trying to understand where it breaks," Kethel replied. "Fine, but I want a sandwich first." 3 hours later, he entered Chamber 2, wearing a different jacket this time, thinner, light fleece. He declined gloves. Temperature started at -5 and dropped steadily. At 10 minutes, wind was introduced, low velocity, then higher. At 20 minutes, he was asked to walk in circles. He obeyed. Pace stayed steady. Breathing didn't change. At 40 minutes, he started singing. It wasn't loud or performative. He simply hummed a melody that none of the researchers recognized. A low tune, something between a lullaby and a folk ballad. His breath plumed visibly, cheeks red now, but eyes relaxed. At 50 minutes, he sat down again, wind still blowing. At 52, he yawned. At 54, he lay back, knees drawn up, and once again started to drift off. The feed cut to black as the team overrode the protocol and opened the chamber. Mark sat up, annoyed. He was just getting comfy. "We observed early-stage fatigue signs. We intervened to prevent hypothermia. I was fine. Your lips were discolored. Cold wind does that. I could still feel my toes." Kethel stepped back from the control panel. "You treat discomfort as background noise." "I treat it like weather," Mark said, wrapping the emergency blanket around his shoulders. "You don't fight it, you pace yourself." In the medical bay, a post-trial check showed nothing out of spec. Slight vasodilation in the feet, minimal numbness. Skin was cold to the touch but showed no signs of frostnip or damage. He passed all coordination and mental status checks. "You've done this kind of thing before," the medic said. "Sure. Once hunkered down behind a snowbank for 14 hours waiting for a rescue helo. No shelter, just my gear." "You slept?" "Had to. No use being awake and freezing. Your body burns too much energy panicking." "Would you say you trained for this?" Mark gave a soft laugh. "Nah, I just grew up somewhere that made being cold a part of daily life." The team didn't respond immediately, not because they lacked information, but because every new fact made less sense than the one before it. They reviewed the footage late into the night. The singing, the posture, the stillness, and most of all, the refusal of the body to follow predicted decline curves. Finally, someone asked the question none of them wanted to voice. "Are humans just resistant to cold?" Kethel shook his head. "No, not all of them. But the ones who are, they don't resist. They accept it. That's worse." Mark returned to the mess hall the next morning, found a tray of hot food waiting, protein strips, stewed grains, and a mug of coffee. One of the interns approached. "You planning on entering Chamber 3 today?" "Only if you make it snow in there," Mark said, smirking. "Beneath the thick layer of snow? Snow makes it easier to sleep. Deadened sound. Soft surface. You guys ever hear of a snow cave?" The intern blinked. "You sleep inside snow?" Mark leaned back in his chair. "Oh, you poor things. You've never camped properly." The Arxin team now had more data than they could analyze. But every variable led to the same result. When exposed to cold, humans didn't always resist. Sometimes they took a nap, and that was starting to scare them. Dr. Kethel adjusted the environmental settings for Chamber 3 himself. This time, the trial wouldn't rely solely on passive exposure. It would simulate what no one on the Arxin team had ever experienced: a sudden cold snap combined with an emergency scenario. The setup was simple. The chamber would begin at a mild 0 degrees Celsius. Within 10 minutes, it would drop rapidly to -20, accompanied by high wind speeds, light strobing, and an artificial power loss blackout. Mark would be left inside with a backpack of basic supplies, a mylar sheet, a portable thermos of water, and a pair of wool socks. "This test is not to induce harm," Kethill told him that morning. "We want to observe adaptive decision-making during a stress response." Mark smiled faintly. "You want to see what I do when it all goes wrong?" "Yes. Sounds like home." By now, several researchers had joined purely to witness the trials. They filled the observation hall, whispering predictions, analyzing previous footage frame by frame. ArcScene media technicians had even installed additional body heat mapping cameras, something previously reserved for deep space exposure tests. Mark entered the chamber, placed the bag neatly beside the wall, and removed his boots. His feet, sock-covered, padded silently across the frosted floor. He placed the mylar sheet next to the vent, where the chamber's humidity output would condense and subtly warm the air. At minute 11, the lights cut out and the temperature plummeted. Winds began blasting across the floor. Mark didn't flinch. He zipped his jacket up to the collar, tucked the water thermos beneath his shirt, and lay down in the corner, using the backpack as a pillow. He pulled the sheet over his upper body and adjusted his knees to his chest. And went still. Kethill leaned toward the monitor. "What is he doing?" "Conserving heat," the analyst said. "He's using the backpack as insulation and creating a closed space between his thighs and torso. Classic fetal tuck posture. Mylar captures reflected body heat. You cannot sleep through that." No one responded. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The body heat mapping showed reduced activity. No shivering, no panic movements, but not hypothermic stillness either. Breathing remains slow and steady. "He's meditating," said one of the interns, "or doing controlled rest." Controlled? Humans sometimes train themselves to nap under stress. Combat medics, Arctic rangers. They shut down non-essential functions and trust the gear to do the work. At minute 26, Mark shifted slightly, rewrapped the mylar, and murmured something. The microphone picked up a phrase. "Give it another hour. Let the weather do its thing." The researchers looked at each other. At minute 30, Kethill stopped the trial. The lights returned. The wind ceased. The temperature climbed back to 10 degrees. Mark opened one eye, yawned, and sat up. "You guys got weird ideas of fun," he muttered. "You maintained stable core temperature for the entire event," Kethill said through the intercom. "Well, yeah," Mark replied. "If I started walking around or stripping off layers, sure, I'd be in trouble. But the key is to stay ahead of the loss. Don't burn through energy, just keep the heat you've got. You made no effort to alert us. You said the power went out. What good would flailing do? Besides, it wasn't cold enough to worry. Minus 20 degrees and simulated wind chill are not worrying?" Mark laughed. "You ever fall asleep in a deer blind during a January storm? You get used to minus 20. You just don't move much." Kethill turned to his team. "Run neural stress markers. There must be some elevation." The readings came back 10 minutes later. Cortisol, baseline. Adrenaline, unremarkable. Pulse variations, normal for someone asleep or at rest. Brain activity, low theta wave pattern, consistent with light sleep and sensory detachment. "He didn't just endure the stress," the medic said. "He never registered it as a threat." "That can't be right." His nervous system didn't respond the way ours would. No elevated cardiac strain, no anticipatory tension. One of the newer analysts flipped through a data pad. "There's a term in their language, being used to it. It describes low-grade immunity through long-term exposure. Not biological immunity, but psychological. Habitation. Yes. He doesn't fear the cold because he understands it." Later that day, Kethill met Mark in the hallway. "You've confused an entire xenobiology department." "Only one?" Kethill paused. "Are you the average human?" Mark shook his head. "Not by a long shot. But I'm not rare either. You'll find a lot of people who know how to live with discomfort, cold, heat, hunger. It's not about being stronger, it's about not fighting what you can't change." Kethill tapped his clawed fingers against his own data tablet. "We assumed adaptation meant alteration, physical transformation, genetic shift. Sometimes it means perspective. That evening, the Arxen lab updated their briefing notes on human thermoregulation. A new section was added: psychological acclimation and behavior-based temperature management. Another section followed: voluntary cold state rest as a survival mechanism. By week's end, Mark had been offered an advisory role, not in physical testing, but in training the research team on human behavior. He accepted with the condition that he never had to sleep on metal floors again. The team agreed, but none of them forgot what they saw. Not strength, not superhuman resistance. A nap in the cold, without fear. Mark's new office was little more than a converted storage cell fitted with a desk, a data terminal, and a small thermal lamp he never bothered to turn on. He kept the temperature low, barely 15 degrees Celsius, which the ARC staff found uncomfortably brisk. That seemed to amuse him. He insisted it helped him think. The alien research base had shifted since the trials. New protocols, new hypotheses, new levels of caution. Cold exposure studies continued, but no longer relied on environmental thresholds alone. Now the focus was behavioral. What people do when things get hard, and more importantly, what they do. Mark was finishing a short lecture for a group of Arxene students when Kithil arrived with an update. "We just completed a multi-species review of sub-zero survival practices," Kithil said, pulling up a projection on the wall. "Of the 20 comparative species examined, humans demonstrated the broadest range of cold adaptation, not just biologically, but in behavior, culture, and learned response." Mark sipped from his mug. "That tracks." "In fact," Kethel continued, "we had to expand our definition of tolerance to include what you referred to as being comfortable with discomfort." "You finally wrote it down?" "It is now part of the behavioral index." Mark leaned back in his chair. "What's the reaction from the higher-ups?" "Confusion, respect, mild disbelief." "I get that a lot." There was a pause. Kethel adjusted the projection. "We have a request. The Arxene Council wants to conduct an expedition to Earth's polar region, but before deploying drones, they want to understand how your kind stays functional in those extremes. Not from a lab, from the field." "You asking me to go back to the ice?" "Yes, lead a team, advise, demonstrate." Mark didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the far wall, and looked out at the simulated sky on the dome's outer display. "Give me real gear. No plastic boots. I want wool layers, insulated canvas, something that doesn't fry circuits when it gets wet." "We can accommodate that." "And coffee, the strong kind, none of that powdered algae blend." Kethil's expression remained unreadable. "Of course." Mark turned back. "Then yeah, I'll take you into the cold." The expedition began 6 days later. They landed on the edge of Earth's southern hemisphere ice shelf, near an abandoned research station half buried in snowdrifts. Temperatures hovered near -30, with sudden gusts that carved the landscape into hard, glittering dunes. The Arxene engineers arrived in thermal suits rated for vacuum exposure. Mark wore a layered outfit of wool, down, and a windproof shell, his face exposed to the cold air. He moved comfortably. The others, less so. Their breath frosted up their visors. Movement was slow. Grip failed. One technician's instrument pack froze solid. Mark repaired it with a lighter and a gloved hand. "How are you not affected?" one asked, teeth chattering despite thermal assistance. "I'm affected," Mark said. "I'm just not surprised." At night, he dug shallow snow pits and taught the team how to shield themselves from wind with walls and tarps. They expected shelter construction to take hours. Mark finished his in 20 minutes. The team slept in heated pods. Mark slept in his pit, a rolled sleeping bag and a hat covering most of his face. In the morning, they found him boiling water over a small camp stove, steam rising around him in a halo. "You could have joined us," Kethel said. "I was more comfortable outside." "You chose cold over comfort?" "I chose control over dependency." That day, they encountered a whiteout. Visibility dropped to under 5 meters. Communication lagged. The ARC scene struggled to navigate through the horizontal snow. One student panicked and fell behind. Mark circled back, found him pressed against a frozen bluff, shivering uncontrollably. "I lost the path," the student gasped. "Don't talk," Mark said, pressing a gloved hand to his shoulder. "We're close. You just need to move." "I can't feel my fingers." "That's because you gripped your scanner bare-handed. You've got cold shock, not frostbite." "What do I do?" "Breathe. Slow. Follow my steps." Mark guided him back step by step, using voice commands and steady pressure. When they reached the group, the student collapsed. He was checked immediately, hands red and stiff but not damaged, core temperature slightly low but within range. The recovery was fast, the lesson was lasting. Later that evening, Kethel approached Mark beside the supply cache. "You knew exactly what to do, not from a protocol. No, from experience. You've been lost in weather like this more times than I care to count." Kethel's eyes narrowed slightly. "You said something earlier, that you're affected, just not surprised. Is that the key?" "It's part of it," Mark said. "We don't conquer the cold. We live with it. You learn the limits, then you work inside them. That's not strength, that's The expedition returned a week later. The report Kethel filed didn't include Mark's medical data or endurance logs. Instead, it included behavioral markers, field strategies, risk management notes, and a final sentence that would be quoted for decades across ARC scene training programs. Human resilience is not about resistance to conditions. It is about refusing to panic when the inevitable arrives. Back on the orbital station, Mark resumed his lectures. Not just about temperature, but about stress, adaptation, and the strange, stubborn calm that had kept his species alive in places no one else wanted to live. At the end of one seminar, a young ArcSync student raised a claw. "If you don't mind," the student asked, "how do you train for such cold?" Mark paused, then smiled. "You don't. You just stay long enough to stop fighting it. Then, when everyone else is freezing, you get a blanket, curl up, and take a nap." The room was quiet, but no one laughed. They were too busy writing that down.